In this section, we will cover the basic parts of a camera and how to operate it. Follow along with a camera on hand to practice. By the end of this lesson, hopefully you will feel prepared to operate the camera in the field. Remember, practicing more will help with gaining confidence in making sure you can acquire the footage that you need in the moment. So let's get started. When you pick up a camera for a shoot, two of the first things that you want to do are turning the camera on and taking off the lens cap. And now your camera is on. But depending on your camera, your image may or may not be showing up on your screen. This brings up the topic of the viewfinder and live view. The viewfinder is where you look through when you raise your camera to your eye. Live view refers to the screen. Mirrorless cameras don't have a mirror reflecting the image to your viewfinder, and instead your viewfinder is basically just a tiny high-resolution screen. DSLR cameras, on the other hand, have optical viewfinders because of a physical mirror in the camera that reflects the light to your eye when you look through the viewfinder. So, depending on how your camera is set up, you may or may not have an image showing up on your screen, but there will probably be some digital information on your screen to let you know that your device is on. On your camera, there should be a button that allows you to change how you monitor your image. Before we talk about what the information on the screen means, let's look at the common buttons and dials that are present on your camera. The basic buttons are the shutter button, record button, mode dial, auto exposure dial, and usually dials for aperture and shutter speed. The shutter button is for taking photos, and when the button actuates, the shutter will open and close on your camera, taking a photo. The record button is for recording videos. It starts the first time you click and stops the second time. On the mode dial, we are able to choose different exposure modes for photography and also a mode for recording video. The N mode, which stands for manual, will hopefully be the mode you have your camera normally set to by the end of this course. Manual mode allows you to have the most control over how your image will turn out. We will talk about the other exposure modes on the dial, A, S, and P, in the next lesson on exposure. The auto exposure dial also relates to each of these different modes, so we will also discuss that then. So for now, let's set our camera to the M setting on the dial. M, or manual, will give us the most control over the exposure of our image. Now that our exposure settings are unlocked, let's look at the dials that let us control the exposure. There's usually a dial to control shutter speed and a dial to control aperture. There may not be a dial for ISO or ISO. To change the ISO, you will need to first click the ISO button and then use the dial to adjust your ISO setting. In the next lesson on exposure, we will talk more in depth about these three exposure settings: ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. Another button to be familiar with is the playback button, which lets you review the footage you have taken, and also take note of the menu button that will give you access to more settings such as changing your file types and setting up grids. In this lesson, we have covered the different basic buttons and functions on the camera, including the shutter and record button, the mode dial, and exposure controls. As you operate the camera more, the more familiar you will become with these basic operations. While at first it may seem overwhelming, after a while adjusting these knobs, especially the shutter, aperture, and shutter speed knobs, it will become like second nature. If you are using a camera for the first time, take the time to familiarize yourself with the controls before starting a shoot. In the next lesson, we will learn more about manual exposure.